I will hand over now with the moderation to my good colleague Suzana Carp. And Suzana, I need to remind you that we were standing in the European Parliament saying we need to go on stage with all of this. I think we didn't anticipate that it would happen later, but now we are. So please come on stage and moderate for us the session on the new energy market design, together with Daniel Mays from the European Commission, Gerasimus Thomas from the Commission itself, Mark Benyon from EDF, and Hannah Dillon. And I didn't note the company, and I probably say it wrong. So I'll let Suzana introduce them. I want to say one more time thank you also to the Commission and to Vice President Franz Timmermans that he has given us a very competent person to speak here on his behalf this morning, and also to Mark Benyon and the others for making time on stage. But with that, I hand over to Suzana, and please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here online or in person. It's truly a joy to join you today, and that's not necessarily because I get to be here in person and meet some of you. It's also not necessarily because the building is outstanding and it's fascinating to just be here, but it's actually so exciting because it's my first time taking part in the European Heat Pump Association Annual Forum. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to the discussions we'll be having today. Now, to kickstart the series of panels that we're having today, I want to set a bit the stage for the first panel, which is the role of carbon pricing in the new energy market. And I will start by saying that we are all meeting here today to share visions, solutions, and policies for how the heating sector can be 100% carbon emissions free by 2050. Carbon pricing is part of the solution, and that is because in order to become 100% carbon emissions free, ironically, carbon emissions need to stop being free. Now, eliminating carbon emissions can be achieved with a deep deployment at scale of net zero solutions. Unfortunately, that's not happening at the scale required, as you all know very well. And part of the reason for that is that the markets are not actually fully getting the signal of how urgent the climate emergency is, and also just how little space we've got left in the atmosphere until we meet the temperature increase scenarios associated with that we've agreed to not overshoot under the Paris Agreement. Now, I want to maybe just share a little, just a few thoughts from my experience, having worked on carbon pricing in the EU for several years in the past, and then I will move on to quiz my panelists and also give you a chance to exchange. But for sure, the EU has been a pioneer in carbon pricing, introducing the first international emissions trading system in the world. It's very interesting because for many years it was and continues to be hailed by some as the cornerstone of the EU climate policy. At the same time, for many years, it was also ridiculed and caricatured by some, saying that it wasn't delivering and that the price of allowances was insufficient. And so, because of that, there were two schools of thought that had developed in the European Union, and the debate in Brussels used to be quite fragmented between these two. There were those who believed in carbon pricing and that wanted, let's say, an ETS-only system, whereas there was the other school of thought, which was very deeply attached to the power of targets, standards in driving decarbonization. Now, I argue that everything has changed and that we're in a fundamentally different spot today, and this is the point of departure for our discussion. Of course, since 2018, we've all seen that the price for EUA allowances has increased, and whereas the ETS was perhaps badly performing before, it has become a very dynamic market, and most surprisingly, to many of us, including to Vice President Timmermans, but it's become one of the best performing markets in the world during the time of a global pandemic. So that is not insignificant, and it's not insignificant for our discussion today, but it's also putting out the global message that not only does climate change need to be addressed, but that we have the knowledge to do so through policies which involve carbon pricing that works effectively. And up until 2 months ago, when the Fit for 55 package was released, we still were very much in those two separate sort of schools of thought. And what we're seeing with the EU Green Deal is that we have entered a new dawn for the conversation on carbon pricing in Europe. I recall in the last revision, we used to say the reason you would integrate the sectors into a unified, let's say, carbon market was actually the reason to keep them apart. To clarify, if you were to integrate them to have faster, more effective and more predictable decarbonization, it was considered even 4 or 5 years ago that the best way forward was by keeping the sectors apart between the traded sectors and the non-traded sectors, of which buildings was one. So it's very interesting because actually that was part of the fact that the technology landscape back then was different than where it is today. We've talked about the EUA price. I won't mention it again, but certainly there was the idea that the technologies in the sectors covered by the effort sharing regulation, so the building sector, were further behind in their, let's say, development and deployment phase than those covered by the EU ETS. And so what we're seeing is that actually slowly but steadily, we are having net zero technologies becoming more and more of an available choice. Which means that this is the right point in time to be talking about impetus policies, catalyzing policies, such as the introduction of carbon pricing to facilitate the transition. So, of course, we will be discussing different aspects of this with the panel. Carbon pricing is not the only policy. It won't be sufficient, and this is something very interesting that we're seeing in the European Green Deal. We're seeing an approach that has been described as a systemic approach that, although it puts carbon pricing at its core, it does not give up on the role of other policies. So there is much to discuss, much to unpack, and I very much look forward to do so with my panelists. I will start by introducing the ones on stage here with me. And just to also mention, we have 2 more online. Okay. Hello, I see you. This is great. Okay, so on stage we have Mr. Daniel Mess, who's a member of Cabinet with the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, working on the EU Green Deal, as I'm sure you're all aware. Daniel started his commission in the European Commission through competition law, which is he's a lawyer and he has worked in the previous commission also in ensuring the connection between the European Commission and enhancing relations between the Commission, the Parliament and the EU Council. He was also a speechwriter for Commissioner Vestager. That's very nice. I've appreciated her speeches very much. Congratulations. Okay, next to him we have Mr. Mark Benayoun, who is the Group Senior Executive Vice President, Customers and Energy Services for EDF. Mr. Benayoun has been with EDF since 2009, when he joined as Tariffs and Prices Director at the Commerce Division. In 2012, he became Director for Business Customers Market. In this role, he managed a project that ended regulated electricity tariffs for companies and local communities, so he will have very interesting insights to share with us. He also served as the CEO of Edison, which is the 3rd largest energy company in Italy. Now, online, we have Mrs. Hannah Dillon, who is joining us from the UK. She is head of Zero Carbon, which is an environmental advocacy campaign calling the UK government to phase out subsidies towards fossil fuels, while at the same time to expand and introduce stronger, more effective and fairer carbon pricing. Prior to this role, she was the Director of Climate Campaigns at Project Everyone, where she was driving awareness and advocacy about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly with regards to climate, oceans and biodiversity. And also from the European Commission, we are delighted to see, we just received an email earlier that perhaps we wouldn't be able to have Mr. Gerasimos Thomas with us, but I'm delighted to see him online. Thank you very much for your participation. He is the Director General in the European Commission's Directorate for Taxation and Customs Union. In the past, Mr. Gerasimos was Deputy Minister for Environment and Energy in Greece. He was also Deputy Director for the Directorate for Energy in the European Commission, Director for Finance in DG ECFIN, and currently sits on the board of EIB and the EIF. So I think the panel is looking extremely interesting, and I will actually like to start with a question to Daniel. We have seen that the European Commission has made these very courageous steps ahead that I've just referred to by introducing a different approach to the way we are talking about the intersection between carbon policies and climate policies, energy policies. Could you please update us, as well as the audience, so myself and the audience, on how your team realize this vision? How exactly did you decide to actually place carbon pricing at the core of the package while also preserving other policies? And how do you anticipate that this will affect electricity market design in Europe?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks first of all for inviting me, for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here with this industry, which is really one of the industries of the future. The European Green Deal is very much also about creating promising industries, and the heat pump industry is definitely one of those within the Green Deal. So I'm really pleased to be here. It's almost back to the future, because the heat pump already has a very long history, going back centuries. And the future will only be better, I think, with the European Green Deal. But I'll get back to that, because of course we are living. Coming back to your question on like carbon pricing and its role in our climate and energy proposals, we are of course living in a bit in interesting times, because we do see the energy prices rise, and people are justifiably so concerned about that. What I take as a sign of that makes me moderately optimistic is that many people are actually saying, if you really look at what's happening with the energy prices, the main part of the problem is actually with the fact that we rely too much on gas, and that we rely too much on gas from limited suppliers, and that causes these price effects. And a lot of commentators agree with that. I also take optimism from the fact that people say that's why, on top of something needs to be done, clearly, because people need to have the comfort that they can still come along in this energy transition, and we will come out with a communication on that early October. But I think that like the general voice bit, like, yeah, we need to accelerate. Actually, we need to accelerate this move to renewables, and renewables that are affordable for everyone. If we would have had the European Green Deal 5 years ago, with this acceleration towards renewables, we would not have been in this situation with the energy price that we see in certain countries. But it does, of course, have an effect also on the debate on carbon pricing and the proposals that we've made, especially the proposals for the built environment and transport. I think that there, as you say already, making a transition also means that there must be a trigger to really innovate and a trigger to have a price there. We also just basically thought, I come from Rotterdam, and in the Rotterdam harbor you have a big chemical plant running on fossil fuels, and that is part of the ETS, because that plant is producing, and also the electricity power companies there are in the ETS. Right next to that building, like really next to it, is a company that makes transport fuels. So for us it started to look a bit disingenuous to have like one plant that produces electricity in and one plant that produces transport fuels out. I think that is like something to emphasize. The ETS proposal that we made with carbon pricing sets a carbon price for the suppliers. So for the suppliers of the transport and the energy fuels. It's not like something that is directly on households. But of course, given the fact that like living in a home is sensitive, and the decision to buy a heat pump is an individual one, and not everybody can afford it. So the concerns we also very much saw that people could be worried about the social impact of these proposals. That's why we've proposed this European Social Climate Fund alongside it, funding that comes from these revenues from carbon pricing and carbon permits, and that it could then be used by member states to compensate households to make it easier for them to switch to the clean energy solutions. Now, of course, this is now in Parliament and Council. You have a discussion on that right now. I think that the challenge is a bit, and we scratched our heads also, if you would take this out of the package, carbon pricing, you would need an alternative to get to your minus 55% target. There is no other choice than to get to this minus 55% less emissions in 2030, because it's binding. It's in the European climate law. And then when you look at the alternatives, and you highlighted it already a bit, there are indeed people that say, okay, let's then increase the energy performance standards for buildings, for instance. But I would say the social impact is then the same, because if you would have prescribed that every house needs to be energy level B at the very least, there will be people for whom that will be easy to do, and there will be people for whom that will be difficult to do. So you won't avoid this social impact. And our thinking was like with the ETS and the sub-fund, you have a benefit that you generate funds, you generate revenues, you have carbon pricing, you generate something, and that money can be put to use to reduce this social impact. My boss has always said, like also in the debate in Parliament and Council, like this is my thinking. My thinking is, it seems to be an indispensable part of the package, but we need to be mindful of the social impact. If people come up with alternatives that do the same thing, then of course we need to have an open dialogue on that, because this is a Commission proposal. But so far it looks not very easy to find those alternatives.
Thank you very much. That was a really comprehensive answer, and I very much appreciated that you referred to the necessity of reaching the targets. Now, of course, my favorite thing about cap and trade systems is that you have a cap which guarantees the environmental integrity of a certain trajectory or a certain scheme. So I very much appreciate that element. Without meaning to really grill you, but I will just ask a further question about the impact you're expecting to see with your proposal of policies. You have referred to the social impact and how you plan to alleviate that, but in terms of the technology landscape, how do you expect that the carbon market or the second ETS will spur technology uptake?
Yeah, that's of course like one of the most important effects of that. Sorry for like missing that point actually, because that's the point like where we need this industry actually to work with us, because in the climate action field, it's never enough to set targets. You need to embrace innovation, and you need to embrace industry that brings these innovations, because the best service we can do to society is that we have actually bring new solutions that are affordable and that work. And heat pumps are absolutely important in that sense. I realize that in every country it's a bit different, the situation, like, where heat pump makes sense, but I think that overall you see quite a movement that is very helpful for this industry. You either have member states that just look at the numbers and then say, well, a heat pump makes sense to deal with the problem that not everybody can insulate the house, especially live in an old building in an historic center, so this can be part of the solution. And you have member states where even if that's less the case, they still really want to be seen to take climate action, and they still want to be seen to do the right thing for the planet, and that the heat pump industry can also bank on. So whatever we do, like also with the big proposals, we also need to make sure that our entire policy framework, our entire market design helps also a technology like heat pumps to make it to everyone, from the new buildings to the ones that are a bit more challenging, because there are challenges in certain buildings.
Indeed. Thank you very much. And I would now like to actually jump to the UK and hear a little bit from Hannah. Perhaps if you wouldn't mind telling us about zero carbon and how and why it was created shortly after the UK's commitment to the adoption of a net zero target. What's the connection that you see between your campaign and the successful achievement of such a target?
Hi, Suzana. Thank you for having me. I am in the UK. It's decided to be sunny today, so sorry if my face disappears from time to time. It's a rare occurrence these days. So we set up the Zero Carbon campaign in response to the announcement of the UK government's 2050 net zero target, precisely because we think, as has just been mentioned, it's fantastic to have targets, but until you have the policies in place that are going to help you deliver them, then those are really just targets. And in terms of carbon pricing, in our opinion, those targets won't be achieved in the timeframes that we're talking about unless we start to factor in the costs of environmental destruction into the cost of production, and therefore unless we start to, as you've said, put a price on carbon and equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. We really do believe that we have to find ways to mobilise the market to prioritise cleaner, greener production processes, which of course is good news for everyone who is watching and there today. So from our perspective, it's not really a question of if we introduce stronger and more effective carbon pricing as part of that net zero policy package that you mentioned, but more a question of when, and critically a question of how. And particularly that question of how, which has just been alluded to, is really important to us. How are we going to deliver these targets in a way that feels fair and equitable, policies such as the Social Climate Fund that was just mentioned are, in our opinion, absolutely critical when it comes not just to carbon pricing, but net zero policy packages in general, because inevitably there will be distributional cost impacts associated with those. And we have to find ways to enable participation in the net zero transition, not just for the wealthiest in society or for the biggest businesses, but actually for everyone to play their role, which is something that we know particularly that the public want to do. We just have to find ways to enable them to do it. So we set up the campaign in response to that target. We started, which will sound familiar to all of you, by setting up a commission of experts to look really deeply into the UK carbon pricing landscape. We conducted a lot of primary academic research, a lot of expert interviews. We conducted extensive public opinion polling, and ultimately we produced a paper called, I think it was titled, How Can Carbon Pricing Help Drive the UK's Transition Towards 2050? And in that paper, we outlined sector by sector where we thought we could strengthen carbon pricing, as well as how the other policy mechanisms that might need to be introduced alongside it. And essentially, ever since we produced that policy paper, we've been campaigning to get support for our proposals at a ministerial and Secretary of State level, but also amongst MPs, their constituents, businesses. Pleased to say that we've engaged with EDF along the journey, also with the civil service, different political parties and campaign groups, essentially anyone that would listen to us. And that's what our campaign's all about.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And I'm sorry to say that unfortunately where I'm sitting, I can't fully hear everything that you say. So I will actually try to move across the stage to see if I can hear better from here. So please apologize, please excuse me if I'll ask a question that might include some of the elements you've mentioned already. But your campaign managed to raise 100,000 signatures, and those signatures are from citizens who endorse actually the proposal of more effective but also fairer carbon pricing. And I was curious if you could share with us a bit about the creative campaigning, the tactics that you have had to adopt in order to build this consensus that you've successfully managed to build.
Absolutely. Suzana, can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you much better.
Great, thank you. Sorry about that. Yes, so we set up a petition which was focused on calling for the introduction of stronger carbon pricing across the UK economy, but also really critically mitigation measures that can help support low-income and vulnerable households through the net zero transition. We have received 100,000 signatures on that petition, as you say, Suzana, and we've just had confirmation that the topic of that petition will actually be debated in Parliament in advance of COP26, which is brilliant news. I thought that I would just share a bit of background on how we went around building support for our proposals, because it might be useful to those of you promoting carbon pricing as part of the net zero policy package. So we knew from the outset that our proposals had to be publicly as well as politically viable if we were going to have any impact whatsoever. And it is partly about getting the right proposals in place, but it's also about presenting them in the right way to the right people. I mentioned our opinion research. We started our campaign by really trying to understand how British people feel about various climate-focused policy interventions. And then we phrased our policy proposals and our communications around those public insights. And I'll just share a bit of what the British public are thinking at the moment, because my hunch is that it probably scales to the audiences that you're thinking about too. So we know that climate change is a concern, is at an all-time high. This persists across age, geographies, finance and political beliefs. We know that people really want to see action from our government to address climate change. So we found that 77% of the British public want the government to deliver a clear and transparent plan for how net zero will be achieved. And they also want to learn more about where the costs are going to fall and how they're going to be mitigated. But also good news is that people really want to take action for themselves, including in the way that they heat their homes. They just don't want to necessarily have to pay for it at the costs that are currently associated with that. There's a lot of support for ensuring that polluters pay for the damage that they do. People really feel that those who produce the most emissions should pay the cost of addressing climate damage rather than ordinary households. And they want the revenues from those payments to be invested in the transition, whether that's funding for innovation, low carbon energy, heating, housing retrofits, which again links to the point that was raised about the Social Climate Fund, which is a really positive move. And ultimately, we found that 7 in 10 people of the British public would support carbon pricing if some of those measures that we've talked about were put in place. So we knew that carbon pricing could gain stronger support. We just had to prove that it could. And so I'll just share a bit about that quickly. In terms of key messages that got traction, simplicity was absolutely key for us, especially for such a complicated topic such as carbon pricing, but as is focusing on the benefits that these policies will bring to people's lives. So we ended up boiling our campaign messaging down to the need to price out pollution, which people seem to instinctively understand, and to talk a bit about how ultimately the government in the UK is subsidising a lot of aspects of the way that we live our lives. We just want to shift the system a bit so that they stop funding the wrong things and start funding the right ones to give more people access to greener, better and healthier lifestyles. In terms of creative tactics, education was really key for us, as you all know, because you're experts in this. Carbon pricing is a really complicated topic. You have to break it down. So we made a lot of explainers and guides that explained what this policy was, what it was going to achieve and how people would benefit from it. And we focused on bottom-up engagement as well as top-down, which I think ultimately is what drove the success of our campaign. The model of deliberative democracy, which in the UK is currently being manifested through citizens' assemblies, is an approach that we really encourage. It gives the public a stake in the policies that are being delivered, which not only means that those policies are fit for purpose, but they're also more likely to be popular. We've conducted a lot of training sessions with constituents, with their MPs. We work with a lot of artists to drive that sort of grassroots engagement on locally specific issues relating to carbon pricing. So for example, during the G7, we created murals in 4 cities around the UK, one of which was specifically focused on the pollution from waste incineration and how that's driving air pollution, which is not only a topic relevant to that community, but also to carbon pricing as well. And we built a lot of partnerships, yes, with businesses, but also with celebrities and influencers, environmental advocacy groups. But the point that we felt was really key was engaging outside of the obvious groups too. So not just with audiences that we know are willing to take climate action, but also those, for example, willing to support anti-poverty action. They might not specifically be engaged with the climate aspects of what we're proposing, but they would certainly support things like social welfare reform. And it was that holistic approach that was really key for us, because as Suzana mentioned at the beginning, carbon pricing is just one of a range of measures that we must use to achieve net zero, and it shouldn't be treated in isolation. Just a final point, which was a bit of a stroke of luck for us, but all of those various tactics combined led us to gaining the support of a brilliant 11-year-old climate activist called Jude. He's fantastic. He decided to walk 200 miles in 20 days across the UK to support our petition. He engaged with MPs along the way. He actually ended up delivering the petition to Downing Street, which was fantastic. And for our part, we made sure that we got him in every paper, on every channel, on every radio station that we possibly could to talk about carbon pricing. And for us, that was really important because, and I'm sure that this will be familiar to many people in the room, mainstreaming carbon pricing is really important. This isn't just something for policy people, it's actually something that we need to drive accessibility around and make carbon pricing relevant to broader audiences. So briefly for us, it was about a solid policy foundation crafted around public and professional insights. On top of that, it was about top-down and grassroots engagement, including a comprehensive political and public affairs engagement strategy, and finally using both education and creative engagement to promote simple benefits-focused messaging. And all of those things combined, along with quite a lot of luck along the way, have helped us secure this 100,000 signatures and really elevate the topic of carbon pricing within UK politics.
Many thanks, Hannah. This is fantastic inspiration, and we will have a very lively debate coming up in the European Union in the next 2 years as well. So I think you've really filled us up with ideas, and we'll reach out to you for more. But certainly, this is a great starting point, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw similar, let's say, campaigns developing here and a possibility to bridge our work. I like to think that all of us are climate campaigners in different ways, in our different roles. We're all working on this most important challenge of our times. So I look forward to discussing further the topics. But while I'm still in the one spot on the stage that allows me to hear the online speakers, I would actually like to move to Mr. Gerasimos and to also thank him once again for taking part himself in the discussion. And that is because Mr. Gerasimos is at the helm of 2 of the most important files in the overall Fit for 55 or Fit for 2030, as I like to call it, package. And those 2 files are the proposed revision of the Energy Taxation Directive and the introduction of a carbon border adjustment. Now, Mr. Gerasimos, could you share with us how you see the role of these two files in the overarching package, and what exactly is it that you perceive to be most transformational about them?
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm happy to be with you today. I think I share a lot of the enthusiasm that Dan Cesar had before, and I agree that the energy transition has to be cool. Unfortunately, I just come from a dentist operation, so I cannot be very cool. I'm sorry if I am not very clear. Uh, I think um, it is important to think of the comprehensive set of tools that we need to have to move to this reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We start from a situation today where in March of 2021, this year, we just entered into force. All the member states have, made law all the decisions that we took 2 years ago to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 43%. So we had a climate package 3 years ago. This entered into law this March, and now we are already bringing a new package to move greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 to 55%. So we are certainly in a situation of acceleration of policy objectives, and we need to use the full range of tools. And I think the holistic package that the Executive Vice President has, Frans Timmermans, has put together, it does this. It uses all the tools available. And you can think of these tools as a pyramid. At the top of the toolbox, lies all the market-based mechanism, namely ETS, its strengthening, its extension, all the market-based instruments. And then at the left side, it lies the regulation. We cannot achieve these targets without regulation, only with carbon pricing or only with the ETS. So we have a package of regulatory measures. And then at the right bottom of the triangle, we have tax. Green taxation is an area that we will have to use more and more to change behavior, to make people change their habits. And the balance between the use of these tools might change over time in Europe. It will be different over time in other parts of the world, because every part of the world, they will eventually have to use the full toolbox. Now, in the Energy Taxation Directive, which is the contribution, let's say, to EU's, let's say, movement in these targets, we decided to do three things. The first, we have changed the base of taxation. As you know, as you probably know, at the moment when it comes to fossil fuels, we just charge the tax by on liters, on volume of fuel. We say so much tax for 1,000 liters of petrol or of gas oil. By charging volume of energy, we give a indirect advantage to fossil fuels vis-à-vis renewables. So we are proposing to change completely the base of taxation to energy content. Energy content is important, and it will bring at par the renewables and the fossil fuel based. So this is an important change that has implication over the long term. We focus at the energy content, and we don't focus on the pure volume. Second, we broaden the taxable base by having more products that are taxed in energy, and we avoid all the exceptions that they exist at the very moment. There are a lot of numerous exceptions in the member states, and then we have to remove them so that we broaden the tax base. And finally, we bring in new sectors, like we bring aviation or waterborne transport, so that we make them taxable for the first time as part of this removal, because we need to get more sectors in. The same way that we get, buildings and transport into the ETS. So I think we have to be conscious that we need to use a broad toolbox in order to move forward, and we need to use it as much as possible. Now, by doing these changes in the Energy Taxation Directive, what we are trying to do then, we will over time increase the rates of taxation, the minimum rates of taxation over a 10-year period, in order to give more and more incentives to abandon fossil fuels and adopt low carbon sources of energy. And just to give you a picture of where we stand at 2022, where we will be, what will be the starting point once we change from volume to energy content. For example, when it talks about heating fuels, we will be in 2022 in a situation that we charge 0.9 euros per gigajoule. Then the natural gas, it will be 0.6, and electricity and renewables are 0.15. So you see a little bit, we will have a new hierarchy of minimum levels of taxation, with electricity and renewables at 0.15, and at the top gas oil on 0.9. So this gives you a sense of the scale, 1 to 9, 1 to 10, on where we will be starting, and eventually over a 10-year period we will try to change this gap and increase this gap, so that the incentives of people is going to be to move to renewable sources of electricity. And I think this, beyond making heat pumps more cool or electric cars more cool, it will also give economic incentives to people, and to focus their minds. Like at the moment, they look at different products in different ways to choose. I think taxation will be an aspect that will contribute to that. Now, these are minimum positive message. Last positive message from me: we are not harmonizing the taxes at the EU. We are setting minimum tax rates that gives an incentive. What is good news is that we have quite a number of member states that already are doing this. So it's not only possible, it's not only feasible, it is being done, as with electric cars in Norway. And I think this is show us that we have a pragmatic approach. We have created a 10-year perspective for the transition. I think, the building stock, when it comes to some of the issues like, the private housing, we need time. In some other issues, we need technologies in the industry. But this is, of course, discussed now in the Council and the Parliament, as Daniel said, and we will see where we end up to. But we have a strategy that it is slightly different than the strategy that we had in the past. It's more comprehensive because we need to accelerate. Everybody is asking us to accelerate. And certainly the youth is asking us to accelerate. Some of the older people like me, or people older than me, they might be hesitant. But I think listening to the young generation, we have to accelerate our efforts.
Thank you very much for that. The key word I take away from your comments is balance. I've heard you use it in referring to the overall package. I've also heard you use it referring to the overall aim of the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive. So that's very interesting. And I also know from just the economic background that there is a connection between what we tax and the way we tax and the elasticity of demand of those products. And so I wonder if we're not actually at the point in time where we are entering, due to the changes in the technology landscape, also a new era of elasticity of demand for the available solutions with regards to net zero. Perhaps the final question I have for you is, could you please tell us, how is carbon treated in the Energy Taxation Directive?
Okay, first the comment. I don't think if I said balance, I mean unbalance. We need to unbalance things. We don't need to balance them. We have a transition, but I think it has to be fast. So I think we create this new hierarchy of fuels with clear perspective to create new priorities, a new ranking. So carbon is taxed. I mean, that's a short question to this. Carbon is and will more and more become taxed. and coal, and for example, it will be very uncompetitive. It will be eliminated. And I think when we look at the full toolbox from the European Commission, you have to keep in mind that in parallel to the Fit for 55 package, we also have the sustainable finance initiatives. So, as you already know, we come then with the financing, and I think we will have the financing will be scarce for polluting and carbon intensive industries products, and I think this will push the private sector change from another perspective. And last but not least, we have consumer preferences. Consumer preferences are changing fast. So, just to take the example of the cars, the many consumers now are pushing, and it's not regulatory driven. That a number of big car companies have announced themselves that they will stop producing combustion engine cars, in the next 5 years. Within the next 5 years, they respond to consumer preferences. So we have regulation and carbon pricing and taxation coming from the government. I think we have financing that it is changing with green financing from the private financial sector. And very important, we have consumer preferences from the people are asking for a greener world, greener products, cleaner electricity.
Thank you very much, and that's actually the perfect transition to EDF, and thank you for referring exactly to the role of companies and consumers have to play in the transition. So, Mr. Benayoun, please tell us, you have very long experience in managing the relationship that exists between carbon pricing and its impact and consumers. So, would you have some insights to share with us? Do you think carbon pricing works? And sort of how if you were to, let's say, give us one piece of advice for how we should approach this debate even, what would that advice be?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to this forum. Well, we have seen in the introduction of the carbon market mechanism in France as part of the ETS in 2005, and I have to say that the EDF group was supportive of this market from day one.